I guess we could start. Did you want to do formal introductions, or do you just want us to do it ourselves? Whatever.
It's so small, maybe you guys can just, if you feel comfortable with that.
I don't know. Am I
You look qualified to do it.
I look qualified to introduce
I
myself.
think you can handle it.
You're listed first, so I'll let you go first.
Okay, thank you. I'm Brooke Duffy. I think I know a lot of you already, actually, so thanks for being here. I also wanted to thank Eamon for his wonderful keynote this morning, which really set the stage for today, and also for the thinking for a lot of these presentations, so it's been very influential. And as you can see, we're talking about transforming internal instructional practices, and we're going to be talking about some theory first, and then we're going to be moving into a little bit more of a practical side of things, like how can we actually start to implement this in our instruction and our instructional environments. And then we'll have some time for discussion, kind of workshopping at the end. And I realize I went too long, so you still haven't introduced yourself.
No, that's quite all right. I'm Lisa Rose Wiles, and we're at Seton Hall University, which those of you who don't know is a private Catholic university in the wonderful township of South Orange in New Jersey, jammed in between various different areas. And I was actually hired as a science librarian, and I very quickly became the science librarian and the health sciences librarian. But last year, our health sciences moved over to a different campus because we now have a medical school. But the way that I got into this wasn't so much through my science side. I'm also the liaison for anthropology, sociology, social work, and psychology, which is how I got enveloped in this contemplative pedagogy, which I'll talk a little bit more as we go through. And I should put in a plug for our wonderful colleague Martha Loesch, who is a cataloger at Seton Hall, who really wanted to be here, but had foolishly made some obligation to her family, which we could not twist her arm to break. I know, right? Get your priorities right.
And these are just our learning objectives that you may have already seen on the website. And so again, we're going to be talking about the theory, the practices, the community, and then we're going to come back to this question about passion for teaching, because I think it's something that we don't always have a lot of time or space to think about. And so your answers that you wrote down, we'll circle back to that at the very end.
So let me start by talking a little bit about this contemplative pedagogy, because unlike critical pedagogy, which we'll talk a little bit about, there's really not anything about this, at least that we could find in the library literature. And contemplative practices in and of themselves, particularly meditation, is nothing new. I mean, this goes back centuries, probably pre-literate. Often, though not always, associated with religious traditions, but it's really only in the last decade or so, particularly the last decade, that this has really started coming into pedagogy. And the way that this has been framed is kind of a multi-step idea. First of all, that contemplative pedagogy really improves focus, right? We all know that today we all struggle with multitasking and distracting things and far too many things to do. A lot of this is to do with technology and so on, and trying to bring back focus. So contemplative practices is one way to do that. But in terms of our students, the idea is not just simply to focus on material, although that's part of it. A great deal of this is to do with making the material connect to students. So there's an overlap here with critical pedagogy, and really putting the students and their lives at the center and seeing how they can adopt, transform, assimilate, whatever word you want to use, the material for themselves and how it's relevant to their own lives, which by the way is a lot easier said than done. And also there's a big part about connectivity, connection to others, connection to community, a big social justice component here. And through this focused attention and heightened awareness, that this really has been shown to foster improved learning. There's a lot of studies out there on particularly meditation, but quite a few other contemplative practices as well, that it really improves understanding of material, retention of material, paying attention to different aspects of teaching. So it's becoming, I wouldn't say mainstream in pedagogy, but it's starting to seep more and more into the literature. And I should have said, I mentioned meditation because I'm into meditation, and if we have time, we might even do a little bit so you can get it here. But there's many other forms. Reflection is a huge component of this. We were talking earlier in the workshop about reflection and how we don't spend enough time doing it, and reflective practices are a big part of this. Journaling, keeping journals of your experiences, and even simple things like music, art. A big one, of course, in religious communities is, standing there and focusing on an icon for hours and hours and hours. But you can do that in a perfectly secular sense of saying, focus on something and what does this image mean to you. And I can give, at the end, we've got a whole reference list, but many studies show that meditation improves cognitive and academic performance, and of course just mental health and well-being and development of the whole person, which really for us at Seton Hall, we have a huge mission about body, mind, and spirit, but most secular institutions have something along those lines of the whole person as well, so not just focusing on the academic. And if I can give a plug for one of my favorite books, this is Dan Barbazat and Mirabai Bush's book. This was sort of the groundbreaker in contemplative practices in higher education. He actually came and gave a talk at our university last year, so I'll be talking a little bit more about that. But he says that CP has really 4 objectives. And the first, as I mentioned, is to focus on attention, focus on building better attention, on introspection, on understanding the course material and how it relates to the student. A big one is fostering compassion and connectedness, which we don't normally think of as being so much of an academic objective, but I think more and more in higher education that needs to be an objective of not just seeing material in isolation, but seeing it in terms of the community and the larger community, and inquiring into how we think, how your brain works. What we call sometimes metacognition. I'm in a whole group that looks at that, so I won't talk about that for ages. For any of you who are into psychology or education, talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is really about self-actualization, or what Bernard Lonergan would call transformation. There's lots and lots of places. This idea of going beyond your narrow self and just the material that's in front of you and relating it. So that's the short version of CP. So why have we suddenly got all excited about this? Because I said meditation in particular has been around forever. And I think a big one is that there is, and this relates very much to this grit theme, this increasing recognition of stress. I don't know if any of you have seen the awful literature on, what is it, like 1/3 of our students in primary school have some kind of stress or anxiety related disorder and are on all sorts of medication and psychiatric help. The rate of suicide is through the roof, even for college students in some of our own areas. And it's also us. We talk an enormous amount about stress for our students and how our counseling services are completely overrun. I don't know if any of you have any involvement with them, but they simply can't keep up with the number of students who say they're stressed and anxious and miserable. They have ridiculously high expectations, or their parents do, of what you're going to get out of a university degree. They have massive amounts of debt. A lot of them are working 2 and 3 jobs on the side to try to deal with that. So there's this huge amount of stress for students, but for us as well. And I think in particular in the library, that degree of stress associated with our students, but also associated with our own lives, is something that's only just starting to really be appreciated. I'm going to give another big plug here. Has anybody read The Slow Professor? Oh, you should. It's an eye-opener. I read it while I was on sabbatical, and I swore I was going to change my life and stop buying into the culture of, it's normal to be stressed and say, oh my God, I've got so much to do, I can't even think, I can't even, oh. That's a good thing, right? And we all sort of buy into this culture, and I think we do it to ourselves a lot. You did more with less. wow, you did so much this year. Let's go out and do even more. You know, that once you get on that treadmill, right, you don't even realize that you're doing it to yourself. Sabbatical's a wonderful thing because then you sit back and you can make all these resolutions about not doing it anymore. What did mine last?
A day.
No, a little more than that. Maybe a week, maybe a week. I kept saying I wasn't going to volunteer for things, but it didn't happen. Another really lovely quote. This comes from a friend of mine who's actually a priest in diplomacy. And we were talking about our approaches to education and just to doing things in general. And we said, well, I think we're microwaving when we should be slow roasting. So that's a quote attributable to Father Brian Muzak. And the other thing too that really relates this to this conference theme of where this comes from, all this do more with less stuff, it really is associated with the corporatization of higher education. And I don't just mean the for-profit universities, I mean just generally this whole focus on the bottom line, this obsession with assessment. I'm not against assessment, assessment's good, but when you spend more time assessing what you're doing than doing it, there's a problem. And just things being very fragmented. If I asked all of you, and I won't because we'd be here all day, to write down how many different tasks you have to do on the average day, you think you need more than a page? Right? And how many of them are you trying to do in overlapping time slots? I know for me, it's usually you're trying to do 5 things at once. So none of that really is compatible with the idea of reflective thinking and doing meaningful research and relating yourself to the task at hand. But I said, surprisingly, none of this is in the library literature yet. So we wanted to try to change that. That's the short version of what we want to do there. Critical pedagogy, I needn't say too much about because Eamon, you gave us this wonderful introduction. So this is basically the short version here. As Brooke will say, I never miss an opportunity to quote Bell Hooks. One of my absolute favorite authors.
One of the first things we bonded over. So.
Yes, I was actually one of the professors that I work with in anthropology. We use teaching critical thinking in his anthropology classes, and particularly those that are to do with issues of race and gender and so on. He talks a lot about this idea of decolonizing your mind from the dominant culture, which many of our students really respond to. So this is pretty much embedded now in the library literature. There's a great deal over on critical pedagogy, and thank you for saving me a good 10 minutes of talk there because you did such a wonderful introduction of that. I just quickly flicked to, again, you know, why has this really exploded in the last decade or so? And I think it's because slowly institutions are trying to get a hold of these problems of diversity and racism and social justice and so on. You know, we are a very conservative Catholic university, and we actually had our first big student protest over diversity last year. God bless them. And they're making some progress. This resonates with today's students, and I think with librarians. So in our case, you know, they look at like 40% of our students are minorities, or they're not really minorities, so we can say students of color or whatever description you want to use, and then they look at the faculty, and we are like 85% middle-aged white people. There's a problem there, a big problem. There's also, I think, the other reason this is so much in the literature is it really is intertwined with the ACRL framework. I agree that is certainly not a perfect document, and sometimes it makes me want to grit my teeth. But as you said earlier, it's certainly a huge improvement over, you know, the competent student will be able to do this. We have made, will make you appreciate literature. We will make you. So there's some of that there. And actually Emily came to talk to us, it was just last week, wasn't it? Talking about the way that we can help students challenge the dominant culture and really look at the way, you know, even as librarians in institutions with access to all this literature, we are really very privileged. So just a little bit of background, how on earth a science librarian got involved with this? Well, my background is actually, I'm a biological anthropologist by training until I was reinvented as a librarian a decade or so ago. And because I have a PhD in anthropology, I get to do biological anthropology in particular. I get to do fun things like co-teach classes and be an embedded librarian and actually teach classes other than just library stuff. And one of the most fun things I've been doing for the last decade is I work with a cultural anthropologist whose name is Peter Savastano. He's actually an ordained deacon in the Episcopalian Church. Actually the first openly gay man on a Catholic campus, which gives you a little bit about how much grit this guy's got. And he is a meditator par excellence. Way before it was trendy, he was giving short meditations at the openings of all his classes. Some of his classes, like he teaches a specialty class on anthropology of consciousness, and one on Thomas Merton, who's a famous mystic, does a lot with meditation. So up until that point, I thought, yeah, I know how to meditate. God, I've been doing yoga since I was like 12. I know what that's all about. Very quickly realized I didn't really know what meditation was all about. Not knocking yoga meditation, which is really cool, but yoga meditation is basically about relaxing, which is really nice. Meditation in the pedagogy sense, well, relaxing is a kind of side benefit, but it's really about focusing and concentrating on the one hand, but also opening up your awareness. There's a couple of papers out there that separate these two things. They talk about meditation as being focused meditation on the one hand and opening meditation on the other, and that makes me grit my teeth because it's not one or the other. Ideally, it's both. It's through the focus is how you open yourself up. And I said, if we get a chance, we'll do a short one so you can see what I'm talking about. So are any of you meditating type people? Okay, well, all right. I didn't want to suddenly be, sort of talking about meditation 101 when we've got meditation 14. Sometimes I feel like that. I know a little bit. I'm not a master of it. So the way this got going, Peter Savastano got together with our faculty development group and said, hey, it's about time we started talking about contemplative pedagogy campus-wide. And we found that there were about half a dozen other faculty on campus who were very interested in this. So they organized a retreat, and I just sort of got myself invited into the committee, and I never left. So we started looking at ways that we could bring this to the campus. And one was after we had this retreat, we developed some reading groups. Teacher's Way was one. I ran the Slow Professor one. We had, as I mentioned, Daniel Barbazat to come and give a wonderful talk and a workshop to the faculty. We started having regular meditation meetings and workshops for faculty. And one of the things we're really trying to do now is start to explore some of the outcomes with people who are using meditation and other contemplative practices in their classrooms. So stay tuned, we haven't got any results in from that yet. And really trying to form a community. And Brooke will talk a little bit later about talking about these 3 levels of intervention about at the student, faculty, and actually it's 4, isn't it? Because he separates department and institution.
He does 3. I broke it out into 4.
Gotcha. Yeah. I knew there were 4 somewhere.
Yeah.
So there's various levels of looking at this, and we were kind of looking at bringing it from the level of students and faculty to the broader community. So that's what that's all about. So then comes the, well, gee, all this stuff is really cool and fancy, but we can hardly say we're going to do a 15-minute reflective meditation at the beginning of every 50-minute one-shot we do, right? Much that I would love to do that. So a couple of ways of thinking about this, and we already touched on this earlier in the day, and again, I can't thank you enough for setting this up so beautifully, that critical pedagogy is pretty obviously implicit in the ACRL framework. Authority is constructed and contextual. Yes, we talked a lot about that. And information has value, and unfortunately, sometimes in a very literal way. Nobody here from Elsevier, right? You are from Enough said? Right? Yeah, information has value. You can only have it if you pay us, whatever. Maybe not so obvious that contemplative pedagogy also helps with this idea of information creation as being a process, as being something that you experience and understand and reflect upon, and that ultimately, you have to sort of appreciate how it relates to you. Otherwise, it's just information that you have and then you pass the test and it's gone. So if you don't absorb it, if you don't make it relevant, it really doesn't have any long-term effect. And one thing I love telling students, research is strategic exploration. Have fun with it. Go out there and explore. See what happens. Open yourself up to the idea that you're not just here to get those 3 peer-reviewed articles and check that box. You know, I've written my paper. Now I need 3 peer-reviewed articles to put into it. No, you don't have any students who do that, right? Never heard that. I've written the paper, now I need the articles, right? The idea of exploring and exploring your own consciousness. And the key dispositions in the framework that you can pick out include this being attentive, being focused, being creative, being open-minded. And by the way, there's a whole lot of theology about this too. I promised I wouldn't talk about Bernard Lonergan, didn't I? But there is, there's a ton of stuff there. So the last kind of little piece of this is that research and meditation really have a lot in common because they both involve this idea of being very focused, but also having a heightened awareness, being very open and aware of what else is out there. You know, how often have you had the thing that you're going in there and I'm doing research on the question of why jellyfish have X number of tentacles and why their stingers detach, and you've got this really focused question. And at the end of the day, it really goes in, you know, into a very much broader and more connected ecosystem type of question. And this again is this sort of tension between being very, very focused but being very, very open. And if you're into Parker Palmer, who's another of my favorite teaching type idols, he calls this bounded openness and aware of one's own thinking, or what we often call metacognition. In other words, students thinking about their own learning, thinking about what it means to them, why they're doing it, the questions they're asking, why they're selecting certain things, making that a very conscious process. And this is what meditation really helps you to do, is to focus on how your own mind is operating. Because I don't think we do that nearly enough. I don't think we do that really enough as teachers either. And actually, there's a definition of metacognition in the ACRL framework. It's not quite the one that I would normally use, but it gets the idea across. It's being aware of your own thought processes. Another nice way of thinking about this, and this paper is on our bibliography at the end, and it's actually from a school of theology, but he's talking about this idea of focal things and practices, and the way, on the one hand, you focus, you gather in, and then you radiate out. So a real simple example is a table. What do you think of when you think of table? What does a table stand for?
Are you talking about this kind of table or like
Any
a
kind of
table and a
table.
graph?
Any kind of table.
Oh.
Oh, yes. We anticipated that, didn't we? Well, it can be any kind of table, but we're thinking this kind of table.
Gathering.
Hmm?
Gathering.
Gathering.
Sort of like a resting your things on.
Resting your things on. Anything else with tables? What did we just have?
Meals.
Like eating? There's a whole lot of things, you know, you can sort of say in a religious context, there's all kinds of connotations around tables, you know, family gatherings, all of these things that table kind of symbolizes. And that's the gathering in part. It contains all these meanings, but then on the other hand, this radiating out, when you think of table, it puts out those ideas. Even the idea of an empty table, and I particularly like this one, you know, the idea of an empty table gives the idea of, well, dinner's not had, family members missing. So it's this sort of double-edged symbolism which really makes you think about the way you're thinking about things. Anyway, before I go too far down that rabbit hole, because we're supposed to be being practical here, I don't know how well you can see this. I can pass around the original, which is actually, it's reproduced in Barbara Sachs' book, but it actually comes from the Center for Mindfulness and so on.
Sorry, I was trying to go to the link, but it's not linked.
I don't know if it goes in all that far. Anyway, he was one of the founding members of this contemplativemind.org, where a lot of this information is available. But just talking about some of the different ways that you can do contemplative practices. Anything from meditation, retreats, visualization, journaling, deep listening, bearing witness, various contemplative arts. One of the ones I particularly like that one of our faculty members did a while back was labyrinth walking, where you walk in silence around a labyrinth and sort of contemplate or do chants or whatever. So there's a lot of things there you can do. So given that we are approaching the halfway point, would people like to try a little 5-minute meditation? Yeah?
Sure.
Not compulsory. Okay, so let me, and this is going to be a very simple, so I'll just set it up for a few minutes, just so you sort of get the idea. One of the things doing this with students, I obviously do the caveat, I am not a Dalai Lama, I am not world authority on meditation. And one of the first things is just the importance of posture, which you don't really think of because body and mind are collected. So we want to sit nice and squarely in the chair. Now, Brooke, I can see you have the problem of not having your feet on the ground. If you are virtually challenged and cannot put your chair down, you can put your feet on a book. As long as it's not a holy book, you can't put your feet on a book. But put your feet on God's actually.
No, I would never.
No, it's not a holy book.
Okay.
Does that work or not high enough?
Not high enough, I'll do this one.
Okay. Oh, yes, you can put them there. But the idea is you really want your feet to be in contact with the ground. At home, I do this with bare feet. Want to sit nice and relaxed, you got it. That's sort of the best posture right there. I'm going to go and grab another chair in a moment. And just take a couple of minutes just to get comfortable. Just, stretch out that tension, little neck rolls, all that type of good stuff, just so that you feel comfortable. And you want to sit with your back in contact with the chair, not, all rigid and so on, but just so that you're nice and comfortable. And here's something, particularly if you're doing this with students, and most people prefer to meditate with your eyes closed just so that it's easy to concentrate. But bear in mind, not everybody is comfortable in sitting in a space with strangers with their eyes closed. People do have sometimes traumatic memories. So if people are more comfortable with their eyes open, you just want to find a focal spot to look at, usually something kind of in front of you, or you can turn around and stare at the wall or the back of somebody's head or whatever. So it's certainly not compulsory to keep your eyes closed. And you're going to realize when you do this, if you're not doing meditation regularly, how difficult the next part is. And when you do it with students, they'll all start fidgeting, I guarantee, within a couple of minutes. That you want to focus and not get distracted by your own thoughts. Really quite difficult. The best way to let this happen is to focus usually on your breathing, like not making a huge production of deep breathing, but just being aware of your own breathing in and breathing out. Or if you're accustomed to it, you can do it with your heartbeat. It's just something to focus on. It also sometimes helps to have a little mantra, like I do a peace, love meditation, like peace breathing in and love breathing out. If that sounds corny, you can come up with whatever you like. And inevitably, when you start doing this, those thoughts are going to start coming. And this is the bit that takes a little bit of practice. Because it's not about blocking off your thoughts. It's not about blocking out the external world. The way that Peter always describes it, and seems to really resonate with people, is think of those thoughts as a movie that's going by you. You can see the movie, you're aware of it, but you're just watching it. You're not getting sucked into it. So when you start thinking about your train home, being late in the traffic and making lists is a very common one, just see it up there on the wall going by. You're focusing on your breathing and you see it up there. You know what it's all about. But you're not part of it. It's not sucking you in. And this is the way we combine this idea of focus with the idea of being open. Similarly to noises that are out there in the room, you're not trying to block them out. You're trying to just let them be aware of them. You'll find you're probably hyper aware of them. If you practice at this, you'll become very aware of things like your hair growing and the blood through your veins and all sorts of nice things. So what I'm going to do, we'll just do a really short one. I will grab my meditation. I didn't bring a real meditation gong, but I do have one on my phone. It'll be quiet, but it should work in here. And we'll just do 5 minutes. I'll do the gong to start with, so we can all start breathing. And then after 5 minutes, it will go off and then just very quietly come back into the room. Is everybody good? All right. Find my meditation gong. I seem to have lost it. Hold on just a second. I thought I had this all set up. There we go. back and have a little shrug. So folks, what did we think? Did the time fly by in alternate zone, or did it seem like forever?
Seemed like forever.
Like forever? So you have some sympathy with how hard it is to get students to engage. By the time you work up to 20 minutes, they're sort of experts at it. And honestly, they do. It takes a while because it's a new practice. But I can remember sometimes in Peter's classes when he'd say, oh, we have too much to cover, we're not going to meditate today, and there would be an outrage that there would be no meditation. So, yeah, I have to say, I find it like, no, that was never 20 minutes, that was barely 2. So, is that a good experience?
Yeah.
Weird experience? Anyway, something different to try. That's something, I'm trying to remember what this app is called. We usually use a real gong, but it's too hard to drag one around. What is that called? Insight timer. All right, I will hand it over to you to continue with the real work now that I did the easy part.
Well, I have to say, for me too, I've never done a meditation in the middle of presenting before, so that's a new one.
Well, we just thought we'd try it because it's easy to talk about something, and I thought too that, you know, when you say that it's a new experience for students and they tend to sit and fidget and so on after the first few minutes, and you think, you know, speaking about what you were talking about, that they just don't know how to do it. But when you do it yourself, you realize that it's actually quite challenging to embrace that.
Yeah. So we're gonna branch, to use that pun, off of this tree into the practical side of things. And just to kind of start you where Lisa and Martha and I started, we were introduced to this image at the Daniel Barbizat talk. And he talked about his 3 levels of intervention that we mentioned before. And on the way out of the meeting, we were talking and we said to each other, I wonder if there's any way to bring this into library instruction. And we felt very skeptical about that notion, given, you know, the obvious, you know, time constraints, you know, faculty buy-in, all of these different things. But we wanted to kind of contemplate how could we actually use some of these practices, maybe the less obvious ones, not so much like a 5-minute meditation and a 50-minute one-shot, but some of the other practices on the tree, because there's a lot there. There's music, there's art, there's walking, there's journaling, there's reflection. There's a lot to work with there. So just to kind of bring you back to Barbizat again, he talked about the 3 levels of intervention, and he talks about the institution, the professor, and then the student. And for librarians, I thought maybe it makes a little bit more sense to break it into 4 levels, because we have our whole institution, and if we have, you know, a contemplative practices group in the institution, that's an obvious way where you could have contemplative practices at an institutional level. But we can also think about bringing them down into these other 4 levels too. So the really big key here is when thinking about individuals, I think the shift is thinking about the whole person. So thinking about the whole student or your whole self as a librarian and as an instructor. And that's kind of the framework for this. So with another thing that Lisa kind of talked about before with the framework is dispositions. How many people are familiar with the concepts of like affective or dispositional teaching? Is that kind of like a new concept? It's still pretty new to me too, but I think when I first read the framework, I was very interested in the fact that there were dispositions for each threshold concept, and that seems like a very challenging notion to me of like, how can we actually get to a student's dispositions? I'm just meeting them for the first time. How am I actually going to, you know, enact change in that kind of deep way? So again, I think one of the big starting points here is the kind of the stress, the burnout, all of that, but then also the experiences that we bring in as teachers and as students. So thinking again about that whole person, the whole capsule that comes in. And Lisa already kind of got into, assessment culture. Again, assessment is extremely important in libraries. A lot of us have accreditation that is based and linked into assessment, so it's not something we can throw out. So this doesn't necessarily fix the structural problems. It's more about, I would say, it's kind of like a quiet protest that starts with the individual and works its way into the community. So it works either way. You can have, an institutional level contemplative practice group, but then you can also have contemplation happening as an individual, and it can work through in both ways. And I think it's really about, empowering us to build compassionate, contemplative spaces and time. Because again, thinking back to the question we opened with, we don't have time, specifically as, instruction librarians, we don't have a lot of time to think about the why of what we're doing, or to really infuse that into what we do. So this really brings that, back into the fore. So I'm going to now talk about the different intervention levels. And I jammed a lot of text on this screen, but I wanted to share this out afterwards so that people had something to bring away, because I don't really think that there's one way to do this, and this is just really early stage brainstorming. And the other thing I'll say too is that a lot of us are already doing similar things in our instruction, but this is about the intentionality of linking it to the contemplation and to the whole person. So thinking on the student level, how do we actually bring contemplative practices into the library instruction classroom, especially if it's a one-shot opportunity? So I was thinking about this. Prior to class, I was just introduced to this new concept of empathy mapping. It's actually not a new concept out there in the world, but Doug Forsham and Annie Faux, Renee Romero at UCLA, were using empathy mapping with their library outreach program. And that basically looks like taking a 4 squared box on a worksheet and thinking about who you're designing something for and thinking about their whole experience. So if I'm going to try to create lesson outcomes for my first year instruction program, it's taking a step back from everything and just saying, well, who's walking into the classroom? What are they bringing with them? And how can I, center their experience within my teaching? So I encourage you to go check that out. I put the link to their empathy map which they used for outreach, but it's something that I'm gonna start doing with my lesson planning, so it's something new that I'm gonna try. This is, again, something we all do, but communicating with faculty and students prior to the class, gathering and sharing information. Who's walking into the class? What are, maybe sending out a brief survey. What are the students' issues, fears, whatever, and how can I then design my class to meet that? The other thing that, I went to LOEX this year, and one of the things that I was really impressed with as a participant in this kind of, a class, a one-shot essentially, was the presentations were labeled if they were interactive or not. And wow, what a concept. When I went into the situation, I knew I was expected to be interactive. And I was like, wow, okay, that really, as an introvert, it's really helpful for me to know I need to bring my energy to the table here. So I think maybe also sharing that in advance with classes, because sometimes I think students are a little startled when I say I'm going to be doing active learning with them. They're like, I thought I was just going to be able to space out for 40 minutes, So I think that can help too. And I think this goes back to critical pedagogy, but really bringing in the interests of the students into your examples. And so again, that might kind of be facilitated in some of that pre-work in getting to know who are the students. And again, a shout out, again, Eamon gave this our definition of deficit thinking earlier. But again, thinking about not only the whole student, but also what are their assets, what are their prior strengths that we're going to tap into to move them to the next level. Because that's how education works. Education is all about scaffolding knowledge onto prior knowledge. And that's when it can be really effective. At the beginning of class, these are kind of like more practical things. We had an amazing education professor from our school come and talk to us about the affective. I asked her, what advice would you give us as an education professor for working with students that we've never met before? And she said, really addressing them when they come into the room, really making them feel comfortable. And a really quick thing you can do, aside from making small talk, which I think is obvious, is she mentioned doing name tags. Just having students fold an index card and write their name and putting it in front of them, because there's a really quick connection you can make with a person when you acknowledge their name in conversation, rather than just being like, you in like the Waldo shirt over there, just like, who are you? And you're Francesca, and what would you have to say about authorities constructed and contextual? It's a quick way to make a connection. Again, quick reflective activities or why questions. We're doing that today a little bit. But I usually try to start a class with a why question, because I really want them to think about, am I just doing this for our good health here, or is there a reason that we're here in the classroom together? And I think it also allows me to, it's a last minute opportunity for me to be responsive too, because students can open up in that context too. We talked about doing short meditations. You may find that a faculty member is receptive to that if you can talk about how meditation is infused within the research process. It may be something interesting to practice. And then during class, this is kind of getting back to the contemplative practices. Again, is some quick resetting things. I think, so since Barbara's here, we used to work at Fairfield University together, and I think there was an activity we did in the beginning of class, which was to draw the internet. So we asked students to just take a big piece of paper and just draw the internet, and they were like, what? But once they quieted down and they started to do it, it was really interesting to see what they came up with and what they did with it, and why they saw it that way. And just that tactile thing of drawing instead of taking notes on the laptop. It's a different way of engaging the brain. I know a lot of people are starting to do this these days, but putting on some quiet music during individual research time. I think a lot of us have periods of time where students end up doing individual research. Sometimes at the end of class. I usually do it in the middle of class. But I always ask for permission from the class. I say, hey, are you all into me putting on some music in the background? And 99% of the time, I don't think I've had a 1% of the time, but I think everyone's on board. I started it out by asking them if they wanted to do the playlist, and that gets a little bit, because then you're taking some time away from the class. But I did a little research on what students study to these days, not research, but Google. And there's an article about this lo-fi beats study YouTube playlist that all college students are listening to study these days. And so I've just been putting that on in the background. That seems to go over well. And yeah, we all do this all the time, but I try to take the narrative of the library providing support, and I try to make it personal, and I try to bring in the whole person. I talk about how, I'm going to be quiet because I was a student in this library, but how I didn't know that the librarian's going to help you. They're way better now, but I didn't know, you know, like I had a research consultation when I was going into my senior year, and that was the first time that I had done that, and I worked in the library. So, you know, I try to tell students that. I say, you know, for me as an undergraduate, that was a missed opportunity. I learned the real powerful effect of someone who's, you know, an information expert, you know, looking over my shoulder and showing me how to navigate research. And so I say, that's our entire job. That's our entire reason for being here, is to, you know, mediate that access and that information and try to get you to it quicker. And I think students, that resonates with a lot of students. So now we're gonna talk about the librarian level. And, you know, this is something that I think we don't talk about enough in the field, but we all have instructional burnout. And so I think it's really important for us to talk about, you know, what we want to work on in our instruction, what our passions and interests are, and also to tap into, you know, some calming practices that we can do with ourselves, both before and after class. I'm gonna show you really quick. This is a Google form that I recently made, and I based it on another colleague's learning log that she uses for herself. Like, she just tracks what she's learned in a meeting or a conference. But I adapted it for instruction, so it's purely for yourself and your own learning. But it's just, you know, how prepared was I for class? What was my mindset immediately prior to class? How did the class go? And I think, oh yeah, overall reflections about the class, what did I learn? But I think the really key thing here is like the kind of mood and preparation, because I think for me those are really linked together, and that really affects what I can do in the classroom. So it's just something to think about. And of course, like conversing with other librarians who teach in or outside of your institution. I do that almost every time I teach. I have a conversation with a colleague about how did it go, what's their feedback, can they offer me any new ideas, that kind of thing. It's how I think we all learn and grow that way. And then at your department level, creating an instruction community of practice. So that's something that Lisa and I have been really involved in doing this spring. You know, I started in January at Seton Hall, but I want to give credit to the fact that, you know, Lisa and Martha and a lot of the other librarians who have tenure have been there a long time and know you have, very interconnected.
We needed new blood.
But also you already had like a social ecosystem there. Like you all really knew each other and were very involved in each other's lives. So coming in, I think it was a really good thing to start to just get to know each other and provide some peer mentorship to one another. Because I do that with people outside my library, but I think it's, you know, I've worked places where there isn't necessarily like a good internal culture, and a lot of us have probably worked or still work in situations like that. So there are small things we can do to try to create, even if it's not the whole library, a small community of practice around what we're doing, and I really think that will help. Another big thing is, I think, sharing resources, creating a culture of sharing, and making sure that everyone has access to everything they need all the time, and things that might spark interest and passion for them to grow in their instruction. Like everywhere I work, I try to start an instruction resources repository for everyone to share lesson plans and ideas and stuff like that. Lisa, as you've seen, has done guided group meditations for us. She did it at the beginning of a faculty retreat that we had, and it made the difference in starting the day on the right foot for us. And also doing some professional development in-house, bringing the instruction workshops to the people. People have limited resources to go outside, to go to conferences, so this year we made an instruction workshop series in our library that was 5 days long, 2 hours each day, around different topics, and the topics were solicited by the instruction librarians. Okay, so I think we're gonna probably run out of time for all of the active stuff. But I want to make sure that we do talk briefly about this piece, about burnout. So maybe in place of doing a 1-minute paper, we could just kind of open up a little bit about, I guess, any questions you have, but also if anyone wants to talk specifically about instructional burnout, because it's real and I've been there.
Well, I'll just give up with saying that I feel like our instruction has grown a lot over the last number of years, and our staff is decreasing. So I feel a lot of pressure about like keeping those numbers consistent and get that pressure. But the fact of the matter is there's no way to do that. There's not enough of us to do it. So I feel that, and I think it probably affects my teaching too.
Does anyone else have any questions or burnout stories? Yeah.
So earlier, I guess it was in the fall semester, I was feeling like my instruction was becoming like, I've been at my institution for about 5 years, so I was like, yeah, I've done this stuff before, all this, and I had a good lesson plans, I'll just wing it. And I was starting to feel not bored, but like I wasn't really being invested. So I emailed my instruction colleagues and was like, please, here are 5 classes I'm teaching over the next 3 weeks. Please come to them. So that if I just had somebody in the back of the room, it's like, oh watching me. I have to like incorporate this kind of thing. And it really just helped. And I didn't need them to come to the rest of the classes in the semester, but it was a nice way to just feel watched and like get midterm student feedback evaluation kind of thing. So then I made plans to sit down with them after and just have them critique me. This doesn't really have to do with contemplative anything, but that really helped as I was feeling like stuck in my instruction, forcing people to watch
I think
me.
it's not only the feedback, it's also about like, I see students once, and then because I don't really know what effect my teaching has on them, it's okay, you've done this, sometimes it was good, mostly it was a good class because if you connect with them, but you still don't know how they're not going to use what you taught them, is this even worth my time? Because you never hear anything back unless you go to the faculty and say, hey, how many resources, whatever you could do.
That is so true. That's actually one thing I've discovered by accident is I go to like the end of semester research fairs and just walk around and talk to students, and that has always given me like a little like end of semester jolt, because it's like, oh my gosh, they're doing amazing things. Like, and it doesn't have to be like me specifically who is their librarian, but just knowing that, like, I don't know. So I think finding like little things when you feel that.
Yeah, the greatest is actually if somebody comes to the reference desk and says, I was in your class, now I have another question.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're getting to the end of our time. I'll just show you. I wanted to have us have some time to talk together about instruction burnout. But the other thing that I think you can do on your own with the handouts is brainstorm some of the contemplative practices and reflective teaching techniques you can use on those different levels of intervention. So there's space on the worksheet to do that. I'm also happy, our contact information is at the end of this, so please feel free to reach out and ask me, because I would love to continue this conversation, because I'm just at the beginning of thinking about this. So I'd love to talk about it if you think you might use it in some way. Or even if you're like, I don't think this is practical at all, you just wasted my time. So I would like to actually hear that feedback, because I think that will make this better. And this one, if you're not familiar with Veronica Arellano Douglas, she is, I don't know, I've never met her, but like everything she ever writes about is just right where I need to be as a librarian. She has a great blog that's called, I think, Libraries and Inquiry. And she is an instruction coordinator, and she started her spring semester with her librarians by having them do a teaching intention for the semester and decorating it and putting it up in their office like a mantra. And I thought that was cool. I mean, like not everyone's gonna be on board with doing that, but it's, it is tapping into a different kind of thinking, making some art really quickly and then having it be something that's going to resonate with you throughout the semester. So I would encourage you to try that out. And then yeah, this is the end. So this is our contact information. Everything is linked here for people who weren't able to make it today, who might be interested. The slides, our references, and the handout. And the references are a work in progress. I think we're going to do some more with this idea going forward. But there's a lot of reading there. So I would definitely peruse it if you want to go deeper into this. But also feel free to reach out to us if you want specific recommendations. So.
And if anybody finds something on CP in the library literature,
Let us know.
let us know.
Yeah.
Because we've been looking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I totally forgot about this, but I just wanted to like share a thing that I know a librarian does do with this in her instruction. Madeline Charney's at UMass Amherst, and she does a labyrinth at the beginning of each library class that she has. So she prints it out and students do it with their finger.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, that's so cool. I got it.
And I tried it once and it worked, but I should try it more.
That's amazing. Thank you so. I was like, yeah, we could build a labyrinth in the common area, but like, I think the dean would be like, so.
We actually had one, Martin had one, but the problem was it took an awfully long time to lay out. We had it up in the Jubilee Auditorium.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, the seminarian who owned it graduated and went somewhere else into it. But it was like within this room, and you actually walked into the labyrinth. So that makes sense.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Thank you, Neil.
Yeah.
Another thing that our librarians did a couple years ago, I took over one of our instruction meetings and I was like, we're gonna do reflection. So I was like, because I go to places and they're like, you should reflect, but it's like, but how?
Yeah.
So I Googled some things and came up, and there was like, and I'm gonna forget, so I can send you a link to the questions and prompts that we used. It was really nice because it was these very positive reflection questions, like, not just like what worked, but, and I'm forgetting because it was like 2 years ago, but I remember the team being like, after we did it, it was some quiet time in the meeting with a handout of like some positive reflection questions about your instruction and things like that, and then some share back time, and we all were like, let's do that again, and guess what? Didn't do that again, but you're reminding me about it.
Yay.
So I will look it up for me to look, and then I'll send it to you
Please do.
also,
Thank
in
you
case
so
that's
much.
useful. That's more of the departmental level, I would say.
Yeah. Uh-huh. That's great.
Use anyways.
Yeah, right. All right. Anything
Well,
else?
like
No?
those
Thank you so
positive
much.
reflection questions in the form. Giving up your updates today.